Hello, and thank you for tuning in to MEMO's weekly review with me, Nasim Ahmed, and my regular guest, Mouin Rabbani. Hello, Mouin. Good to have you on the show again.
Hi, Nasim. Very good to be with you again.
Yes, we have quite a full show this week. We'll begin with the Israeli airstrike back in November, which turns out killed a number of Israeli hostages. And the interesting thing about that is that the families are saying that is using psychological warfare against the families. So we'll dive into that. Then we'll look at there's an op-ed which was published by the Prime Minister of Palestine on the Washington Post about the day after in Gaza. There are aspirational comments there, but I think it ignores some of the realities. We'll dive into that, have a discussion about the day after, and then we'll move to UNRWA. Lazzarini, who is the chief of UNRWA, has said that Israel is systematically trying to destroy and undermine UNRWA. We'll discuss that, and then we'll move to issues internal within Israel itself. Benjamin Netanyahu allegedly looking to fire his defense minister, Yoav Gallant. And then a shocking story about African asylum seekers who are being told that in exchange for a residency permit, they may have to risk their lives in Gaza fighting against Palestinians in the genocidal campaign. So that's a shocking revelation, which we will dive into. And then we'll finish off with a discussion on the Jewish Chronicle, the scandal that is the Jewish Chronicle here in the UK. And also, let's not forget, this is I think, the fourth anniversary of the so-called Abraham Accords. We'll review that, and there are a couple of other issues we will discuss. Well, let's begin, as I said, Moin, with the death of three hostages, as I said, back in November, which it turns out was the result of Israeli attack. And what was interesting for me was that the mother of one of the hostages came out and said that that the killing was really Netanyahu carrying out psychological warfare against the families. The background to this is that Hamas issued a report with the picture of the hostages and a message saying that Netanyahu is going to kill these hostages. Netanyahu is going to kill your son. And the soldiers dismissed it, saying that it's Hamas just playing mind games and doing psychological warfare. And in response this week, the mother of one of the hostages said that no, it's actually Netanyahu who is doing the psychological warfare against the hostages and their family. For me, that was a shocking. Of course, it's not shocking to hear that Israel has killed its own hostages. They've done that a number of occasions, but the claim by the mother of the Israeli hostages that Netanyahu is the one who is guilty of psychological warfare. Just your comments on that
Well, I
stuff.
think there are several aspects to this development that are interesting. We've known all along that Israel is engaging in the saturation bombing of the Gaza Strip, and it's therefore hardly surprising that in doing so, Israel is killing not only unprecedented numbers of Palestinians, particularly children and other civilians, but also in the process of doing so, killing a number of its own captives and hostages. And of course, Israel says that these killings are inadvertent. And in one sense, they are, meaning that Israel is not aiming to kill them. But you can't kind of engage in this saturation bombing and then act surprised that you're killing not only huge numbers of Palestinians, but every so often also Israelis. And the second point I would make is this relates to the Hannibal Doctrine. The Hannibal Doctrine is part of Israel's military doctrine, which states that dead Israeli soldier is better than a captive Israeli soldier, because an Israeli captive has more value in negotiations for a prisoner exchange than a corpse. We now know that on October 7th, the Hannibal Doctrine was expanded to include not only Israeli military personnel, but also Israeli civilians. And in this context, it wouldn't surprise me that the Israeli leadership, while perhaps not aiming directly at these hostages, also take some satisfaction in learning that they have been killed, because the fewer living captives and hostages remain in the hands of Hamas, from Israel's point of view, the less leverage Hamas will have in the ongoing negotiations for exchange of captives that are going nowhere. The third element is that it took Israel a full 10 months to finally admit the truth, which is that these individuals were killed as a result of Israeli military action, and not as a result of any killing by the Palestinians. And this should tell us several things. First of all, once again, that one can never take any statement by the Israeli leadership, whether the political leadership or the military spokesperson's office. One simply can't take anything they say at face value unless it has been independently confirmed by credible sources. The second aspect of this is that we learn once again that it can take Israel a very, very long time to finally fess up and reveal the truth. Several people have noted another example, which is that in 1982, during the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, one of the first suicide attacks conducted against the headquarters of the Israeli intelligence in the southern Lebanese city of Tyre, that killed dozens of Israeli military personnel, was at the time ascribed to a gas leak. And it was only 40 years later that the Israelis finally admitted that this was one of the most successful attacks against Israel during their decades in Lebanon. And in this context, I think we can also um, cast doubt on numerous other Israeli accounts of the past year, for example, about their military casualties, about how various captives and hostages whose corpses have been recovered met their end, and so on. And that in the end, Israel will be forced to reveal the truth. It might be months, years, decades from now. But it also, I think, casts the international media in an unflattering light, which once again is only really revealing these details, if you will, once they are confirmed by Israel. Absent confirmation by Israel, what others say about Israel and its conduct and so on appears to be for them more or less irrelevant. And I think this is kind of getting ahead of ourselves, because we're also going to talk about the Jewish Chronicle, but it shows how the Israeli government, and particularly Netanyahu, who has essentially built a very successful political career on excelling at demagoguery, has been using this issue of the captives and hostages, not only to promote genocide against the Palestinian people, and not only to seek to outflank his domestic political and security rivals, but even to try to delegitimize and to discredit and to demonize the relatives and friends and others within Israeli society who have been advocating for a ceasefire and for a prisoner exchange in order to bring their loved ones home.
Going back to your point about saturation bombing, of course, when such bombings do take place, they will inevitably destroy schools, hospitals, shelters, protected places, all the above that I mentioned. And what's been interesting, you touched on the media, is how when Israel commits those horrific atrocities, killing civilians, I think the number at the moment is over 41,000 that have been
Yes.
killed. It falsely claims that the victims were somehow exaggerated or they were part of a human shield and is part of a collateral damage. And we're in a vicious cycle now. And as a result, the Western media, we mentioned the Jewish Chronicle, parrots those claims. And Israel feels vindicated and then continues its bombing campaign. And so this is the vicious cycle that we are in. And as a result of that saturation bombing, schools have been destroyed. And it's something which this week, the chief of UNRWA, Philippe Lazzarini, he commented on as following the death of 18, or killing of 18 UNRWA staff who are now probably, I think in terms of numbers, probably close to 200 UNRWA staff that have been killed by Israeli forces since October 7. So he made a statement following the bombing of a school in Gaza, in Nusayrat refugee camp. And he said that UNRWA is trying to systematically destroy UNRWA's infrastructure.
Israel is trying to
Sorry,
systematically
Israel,
destroy.
Hamas. Israel is trying to systematically destroy UNRWA's infrastructure. And but my question first is, do you think Lazzarini is correct? And second, why is Israel so hostile to UNRWA? And third, Western allies know how vital UNRWA is to the relief efforts of UNRWA, given that many of them resumed their funding of UNRWA. Why don't they stop the systematic attack on UNRWA and its schools and its health facilities and shelters?
Well, you don't really have to take Lazzarini's word about any of this. Just look at what Israeli leaders themselves have been saying now for almost a year. Denouncing UNRWA as a terrorist organization, effectively accusing UNRWA of direct participation in the attacks of October 7th of last year, claiming that hundreds, if not thousands, of UNRWA employees are members of Hamas and even its military wing, and launching a concerted campaign of vilification against this UN agency, and stating very explicitly, Israeli leaders and its apologists abroad stating very explicitly that UNRWA needs to be terminated. So it doesn't matter whether or not you agree with Lazzarini. Just look at what the Israelis themselves have been saying about UNRWA, and it substantiates each and every syllable of what Philippe Lazzarini, the Commissioner General of UNRWA, is saying about the Israeli campaign against the organization that he leads. Now, as far as Israel's statements are concerned, every time it bombs an UNRWA school, it says it's no longer a school. Well, of course it's no longer a school because it's been transformed into a shelter for desperately displaced people who have moved there, often on the basis of forced evacuations, of orders given by the Israeli military. And Israel's strategy really has been to corral the civilian population of the Gaza Strip into ever smaller areas of that territory. I think now it's down to 10 or 11%, and to then routinely, systematically bomb them. How does Israel deal with this? Well, it then puts out a statement. This was being used as a command center by Hamas. The UNRWA staff that we killed are members of the Qassam brigades of Hamas and so on. And Israel just puts out these statements. And from Israel's point of view, it doesn't need to persuade its audience that what it's saying is true. it only needs to sow doubt. In other words, its purpose is confusion. As long as the average listener or viewer thinks there are two sides to this story, and it's unclear who's right and who's wrong, as long as members of parliament, government leaders, politicians are willing to still frame such atrocities in the broader context of Israel's right to defend itself, rather than Israel committing genocide against an entire people, then it's mission accomplished, and Israel can continue with these attacks and continue with its campaign to eradicate UNRWA. Now, you also asked, why is Israel interested in eliminating UNRWA? Well, I think it's for a very simple reason. Israel's objective, uh, as is by now, in my view, indisputable, is to make the Gaza Strip unfit for human habitation, to create the conditions in which civilized human organized life is no longer possible in this territory. So, on the one hand, you commit genocide. On the other, you systematically destroy the civilian infrastructure. And then you also target not only the government, which of course is denounced as Hamas, as if every member of the civil service and the NHS and so on in the UK is somehow an activist for the Labour Party or previously the Conservative Party. But you also target the one agency that has been operating in that territory for 70 years, the one agency capable of addressing the unprecedented humanitarian crisis that Gaza is experiencing, and the one agency that the international community has confidence in funding so that it can address this emergency. I really do think it's as simple as that.
So let's turn our attention to Gaza itself, or post genocide Gaza. Um, there's a lot of circles that should be squared when it comes to that. I mean, we can't even arrive at a ceasefire because Netanyahu insists on holding on to, well, conditions which are really not something Hamas can ever concede to, or any party can concede to. So post-Gaza seems a long way away, especially now, given that there is an election coming and people are hedging their bets, whether it be Trump or Kamala Harris. But amidst all that, Palestinian Prime Minister, Mohammad Mustafa, he's published an op-ed in the Washington Post, very aspirational, saying that, we want a one Palestine vision where Gaza and the West Bank becomes one Palestinian state. He's appealed to the international community for support to rebuild Gaza. He wants to empower the Palestinian Authority and deliver a responsive, transparent, accountable governance, in his word. But of course, there's no mention of the fact, what will happen with Hamas, what will happen with Israel's ongoing demand to keep control of Gaza. So one commentator, he basically came out and said, I won't mention his name. He said that, the Mahmoud Abbas traitor regime is touting a day after plan for Gaza in an op-ed to restore collaborator rule under international colonial control. I don't know if you agree with that characterization, but just generally your view on having read the op-ed from Mustafa in the Post.
Well, I did read it, and I have to say it's one of the most scandalous opinion pieces that I've read in many years, and here's why. Mohammed Mustafa is the Prime Minister of the Palestinian Authority. Palestinian Authority claims to represent all Palestinians living under occupation. That, therefore, includes the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. He was given an opportunity to publish an opinion piece, not in some Danish weekly, but in one of the two most important newspapers in the United States, the Washington Post. which is read by the entire political and decision-making elite in Washington, D.C. This opinion piece that Muhammad Mustafa wrote says absolutely doesn't mention the word genocide. You have to read almost halfway through it till you come across the word Israel. It says absolutely nothing about accountability, about holding Israel accountable for its crimes, about making sure that Israel makes amends and reparations and so on for what it has done in Gaza. It says it barely addresses, it doesn't in fact address the role of the United States itself in not only the destruction of the Gaza Strip and the genocide of the past year, but in sustaining what the International Court of Justice now calls an illegal occupation over more than half a century. So, it's really scandalous. And in any normal political system, um, uh, Muhammad Mustafa would have been summarily dismissed for writing a piece such as this and publishing it where he did, and leaving out essentially the most important issues that needed to be addressed. Now, what Muhammad Mustafa does do is it's basically an appeal to the United States to have faith in the Palestinian Authority, that the Palestinian Authority will engage in reform, as if the key issue confronting Palestinians today is not genocide, but budgetary reforms. And he talks about scenarios for a day after, as if there is going to be a day after. I mean, it's really pie in the sky. And I could go on about this for a very
Well, it
long time.
sounded like someone writing a personal statement as to why they should be endorsed. But in this
Yeah,
context, a personal
yeah,
statement as to why they should be, well, he's capitalizing on the genocide and making a
yes.
case for why the Palestinian Authority is still relevant and the role we can play in this whole architecture of, how do we manage this genocide day after? That's what it sounded like to me.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like a prisoner filling out a job application to be able to become an assistant to the prison guards.
Yeah.
It's really scandalous. It's been a long time since I've seen anything similar. And the other interesting aspect is Muhammad Mustafa argues for, I think he calls it a non-partisan transitional government in the Gaza Strip. Okay, that's something reasonable people can discuss and debate, and many may agree with. But on the one hand, he never mentions Hamas. I don't think he mentions Hamas
No.
once in his entire opinion piece. And then when he's talking about the supposedly nonpartisan governing structure, he makes clear that it will be none other than himself who appoints all its officials. Now, given that Mohammed Mustafa is known that his primary role over the past few decades has been as a bagman for Mahmoud Abbas, how nonpartisan is it when effectively he's saying it will be an independent government in which I will be fully in charge and control everything?
Yeah. I don't see his aspiration ever coming true at the moment, especially since even if we take his aspiration to be realistic, I mean, Netanyahu hasn't given no signs that he will give up Gaza or end
Yeah, if
its
if I could just
occupation.
interrupt you, Nasim. I mean, that's the other thing. I think what motivated him is a realization, that Israel has absolutely no interest in the Palestinian Authority anymore. And the current Israeli government is so extreme that it in fact wants to disband its chief surrogate in Palestine because it wants to um, uh, formally annex the entirety of the West Bank. And so Mustafa didn't even go so far as to say that the US, we were appealing to the US to force Israel to provide a role for the Palestinian Authority. That's how meek and diminutive this piece is. I mean, He doesn't even call for the United States to use its influence with the occupation authorities to preserve his own institution.
Talking about the Israeli government, the far-right Israeli government, it seems like they've had enough with the defense minister, the very defense minister who at the beginning in October said that he will cut off food, fuel, and water. It seems like he's not extreme enough for Benjamin Netanyahu. And there's a split now between the two. And the report is that Netanyahu is considering dismissing Gallant over disagreements, due to disagreements over striking Lebanon. So, I mean, is time running out for Gallant, and do you think his dismissal would be really a certainty if Trump was to be elected, or it looks like he may clinch the U.S. election? Because there's a lot of people are looking at the U.S. elections and they don't know which way to go. Some will, like Iran, for example, a lot of their thinking and calculation probably is based on whether it's Kamala Harris or Trump. If Trump comes in, he may be harsh towards Iran, whereas some of the Gulf countries, they're hedging their bets and hoping maybe it's Trump that comes in and Trump may be more friendly towards him. I don't know. There's a lot of these calculations that are taking place. And Netanyahu may also be thinking, okay, if Trump comes in, I can get rid of Gallant. I can go in and invade Lebanon, start another war, another front. So do you think time is really running out for Gallant, and is his fate sealed if Netanyahu thinks Trump is the one who's going to clinch the election?
Well, let's separate those two issues for a moment. First, Yoav Gallant, the Israeli defense minister. With Netanyahu, it's always difficult to determine to what extent his statements and potential actions attributed to him are substantive as opposed to being theater and demagoguery. Having said that, there does also appear to be a deeper issue at stake, which is a dispute between the leading elements of the government, Netanyahu and his closest associates, the neo-fascist wing of his government, Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, respectively Minister of National Security and Minister of Finance, who not only want to continue this war, but want to see its expansion and escalation, and want to see kind of for whom an apocalyptic explosion is, for all intents and purposes, a strategic objective, them on the one hand, and key elements of the security establishment on the other hand, who recognize the increasing quagmire in which Israel finds itself and believe that if Israel were to initiate a full-scale conflict with Lebanon, it will lead to a situation in which Israel is substantially weakened rather than substantially strengthened with a better strategic position. And that's part of it. And when Gallant appeared to be expressing doubts about attacking Lebanon before ending matters in the Gaza Strip, if you will, he appeared to be reflecting the views of many in the security establishment. That would exclude, I don't remember his name, but he's the head of what's called Northern Command in the Israeli military, who is selling this illusion that Israel can go into Lebanon, seize a border zone, and that this will somehow mean the end of Hezbollah and no one else is going to get involved. So that's part of it. Another part of it, as you note, is that Netanyahu would like this conflict to continue at least until the elections, the U.S. presidential elections in early November, if not the change of administration in Washington. And that's because on the one hand, he feels that in Joe Biden, he's found a more malleable partner than he's likely ever to have again in Washington, and that Biden is, in a sense, the perfect vehicle for provoking a direct military conflict between the United States and Iran. And second of all, he may well believe that the outcome of the US presidential election could give him more room to maneuver, particularly if Trump wins. Having said that, I think it's really very difficult to speculate on how different either Harris or Trump will be from each other. Trump may very well tell Netanyahu, game over. I don't want another war in the Middle East, and I certainly don't want U.S. troops involved. Harris, perhaps feeling bruised from the election campaign and the need to re-engage with core constituencies, may also put pressure on Israel to change its policy. But, in the end, I think it's a distinction between the traditional U.S. unconditional support for Israel, which I think both Harris and Trump represent, and fanatical devotion, not only to Israel, but even to its most extreme government ever. And that's the position represented by Joe Biden, who is willing to fully embrace Israeli politicians and support them unconditionally and uncritically, even though they are, people complain about Trump and J.D. Vance. People like Smotrich and what's his name, Ben Gvir, make them look like choir boys.
Yeah.
So you have the situation where Biden is fully embracing and slobbering all over people who are actually much more extreme than those he is seeking to keep out of power in his own country.
Let's turn our attention to a story that just appeared from Israel this week. And we've spoken a lot of times in this review show about just how maniacal Israeli society has become, and also how Israel, in so many ways, is an outlier. On the one hand, it claims to be democracy, but we know there are so many laws within the country which is apartheid in nature. And this is an example of that, just a deep entrenched racism within the country. So this week, the Israeli security forces reportedly offered African asylum seekers permanent residency status if they took part in life-threatening military operations in Gaza. So potentially 30,000 African asylum seekers could be recruited using this kind of deplorable enticements. So when I read that, and of course, I mean, we should mention that such a proposal would never be suggested by any democracy. If we look back at the UK, when the Conservative government suggested the Rwanda proposal, there was massive backlash. And this is just a proposal to process asylum seekers and migrants in another country, not get them to fight on your behalf. And when I read that, it reminded me of a scene from, I don't know if you saw the 2002 Leonardo DiCaprio movie, Gangs of New York. So there's a scene in that movie where Irish immigrants disembark from a ship in New York. And this is taking place during the American Civil War. As they arrive, they are given their papers on the one hand, citizenship papers on the one hand, and a rifle on the other to go and fight for the North. And in this case, of course, they're fighting in the hope that they will have citizenship. But here, the Israelis are turning back the clock, doing something very similar, but they're not even granting citizenship. They're just granting residency permit. So I just that image struck me when I read about this story, that they really are turning back the clock and normalizing things that happened nearly 2 centuries ago.
Well, actually, there is a more recent analogy, and that is the United States and Iraq, where it was also offering a pathway to citizenship to mercenaries who would fight on its behalf in Iraq. And if my memory serves me correctly, quite a few joined this program, and quite a few were basically discarded once they had performed their services, and I would certainly expect nothing different in this case. I think the difference, though, here is that here we're not talking about mercenaries. Here we're not talking about people who see, let's say, a newspaper ad of, come join our occupation of Iraq and destruction of that country, and in exchange we'll give you a pathway to citizenship. As horrible as that is, this is different. We're talking here about a community of political refugees, of asylum seekers, primarily from Sudan and the Horn of Africa, Sudan, South Sudan, Eritrea, Ethiopia. People who have been living in limbo in Israel for many years, and who are now, it's not so much they're being offered, they're, I, I think they're being put under substantial pressure, basically saying, you're in this country illegally. We have full control over what we do with you. And now we're giving you an option. If you will come and fight on our behalf, we will give you a pathway. Again, not to citizenship, because you're not Jewish and we're a Jewish supremacist state, but a pathway to permanent residency. Now, this came out in an article in the Israeli daily Haaretz, and what I found particularly interesting is that at the end of this article, there's a statement that the military censor prevented the newspaper from publishing anything about how these individuals were being deployed. I presume that means that, they were being used either as cannon fodder or for some of the most dangerous tasks that the Israeli army has in the Gaza Strip, or perhaps along the border with Lebanon as well. And in its own way, I think, similar to our previous discussion about Israel's killing of its own captives, this may also explain the underreported level of Israeli military casualties in the Gaza Strip.
Yes, and we should really see that within the context of the fact that Israel is trying to recruit the Jewish Orthodox community who don't want to be part of the military. There's almost like a social contract between the Orthodox and the state of Israel that, you study your Talmud, you study your Torah, and the state will protect you. But now this social contract, which has existed, I would say, from the beginning, is being broken by the government because the genocidal campaign needs more and more recruits. And, the Orthodox community is one pool, and here the migrants and asylum seekers are another pool of for its recruitment. So I think we should keep that context in mind. I want to move quickly on to a story. I mean, it sounds kind of unbelievable given what's happened, what we'll talk about later on with regarding the Jewish Chronicle, the UK's longest Jewish newspaper. So this is sort of related to Yahya Sinwar, the head of Hamas. Apparently, Israel offered him safe passage out of Gaza, and found it humorous because the guy doing the negotiation with Sinwar, Gal Hirsch, who is the hostage envoy, he said that it doesn't mean that he will be granted permanent safe passage, but rather once he leaves, he will be targeted the same way as Palestinians who carried out the 1972 bombings were carried out. So they will be targeted in that manner. So he will be assassinated after he's been given a safe passage. I mean, I found that story quite unbelievable, but it was in Bloomberg, and there's been a lot of reports about it. But what did you make of that? The idea that the Israelis are now thinking of offering Sinwar a safe passage out. I mean, what did you read into that?
Well, this story has been making the rounds actually almost since October of last year. And I think the template that's being applied here is that which Israel ultimately ended up accepting in Lebanon during its invasion of that country in 1982 and siege of Beirut. The idea was that Israel and its local surrogates, the Lebanese forces, would barge into Beirut, eliminate the leadership of the Palestine Liberation Organization, kill them all, and that would be the end of the story. Well, Israel's military proved incapable of entering West Beirut, and its Lebanese surrogates, the Lebanese forces, were unwilling to do the role that had been assigned to them. And so ultimately, the US ended up brokering an agreement whereby Yasser Arafat, George Habash, and the rest of the PLO leadership ended up acquiring safe passage out of Beirut to Tunis, Damascus, and elsewhere. And I think Israel, given its military failures in the Gaza Strip, is now proposing something similar. Of course, the key difference is that Beirut is Lebanese territory and Gaza is Palestinian territory, and there is simply no way that a Palestinian leadership could even consider such an offer without committing political suicide. And it really is a non-starter. And I think if a Palestinian leadership were to accept an Israeli offer to be exiled from their own homeland, there would be hell to pay for doing so. And I think Israel also recognizes this, and it may well be trying to give the impression that this proposal is being discussed and is being considered by the Hamas leadership. And I think it's clear that if it has been made, it was immediately and categorically rejected.
I mean, the reason for me cautiously presenting the backstory for this story is, as I mentioned, because of what's been alleged about Sinwar's plan. So, the UK Jewish Chronicle, which is the longest running Jewish newspaper over the past few weeks, has been running a number of stories. And one of the stories is to do with Sinwar. Apparently, Sinwar is planning to use the tunnels to uh, go to Iran with the hostages, and he's using the hostages as human shields. He's surrounded by the hostages. And that allegation was made by a writer in the Jewish Chronicle who turned out not to be who he claimed he was. And that's created a massive row here in the UK. A number of prominent writers in the Jewish Chronicle have left the publication and resigned. And the main allegation is that the Jewish Chronicle has become Benjamin Netanyahu's propaganda tool because it's serving the narrative of the Israeli leader. So what aspect of that story have you found quite revealing?
Well, quite a few. I mean, first of all, the idea that these correspondents who've recently resigned, Jonathan Friedland, Hadley Freeman, David Baddiel, and a few others, that somehow they've discovered what a putrid institution, the Jewish Chronicle, for which they've been writing regularly, has been, and that somehow they've discovered journalistic principle. That's simply laughable. I mean, the Jewish Chronicle has for years specialized in anti-Palestinian racism, in Islamophobia, in apologia for Israel and for its most extreme policies. But now, because there was a fake journalist on staff, you want to get on your high horse and resign and disassociate. It has absolutely no credibility. So I wanted to say that first. And especially someone like David Baddiel. I mean, someone who, went around in blackface, mocking football players
Footballers.
of color. And so, I mean, you know, for him to denounce anything really as the equivalent of a drunken sailor giving a slurred sermon in favor of sobriety. If there's if there's anyone who has at best 0.00 credibility in this scandal, it's David Baddiel with his colleagues very close behind. Having said that, so the story here is that the Jewish Chronicle, I believe the current chief editor is his name is Jake Wallace Simpson, Simon,
Simmons, yeah.
Simmons, um, hired a fake journalist. In my view, he knew exactly who this person was, rather than recently discovering who he was. And this individual was publishing scoops in the Jewish Chronicle. For example, the one you mentioned about Sinwar somehow seeking to take the captives into Egypt, and from there, I presume, take a commercial flight from Cairo International Airport to Tehran. Um, the stories this guy was providing somehow seemed to perfectly align with Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu's agenda vis-a-vis these so-called ceasefire and prisoner exchange negotiations. It was a pure coincidence. And the Jewish Chronicle and its chief editor had absolutely no problem publishing these stories until um, it was exposed in the Israeli media that these stories were fake, that they were essentially being planted by Netanyahu's office in order to serve his political agenda. And then all of a sudden, this guy was fired, and that was supposed to be the end of it. But it's quite clear the Jewish Chronicle's editor knew exactly what he was doing, has absolutely refused to resign. And there's another element to the story, which is that Robbie Gibb, not of the Bee Gees, but of the BBC, has is closely involved with Jewish Chronicle, and is also on the board of governors of the BBC, and has been consistently pulling his weight to transform the BBC from a globally respected news organization into a mouthpiece for Israel and its current government. And I think the final aspect I'd like to say about this is, we don't even know who owns a Jewish Chronicle. Um, uh, in recent years, it has basically been transformed into an extremist right-wing rag, which all these people we were talking about previously were quite happy to write for until they were exposed by this latest scandal. But a few years ago, it underwent a change of ownership, and the Jewish Chronicle won't even go on record and tell us who owns it.
And on that point, what I found quite interesting in Friedland's resignation letter, which can be viewed on his X account, it's quite a lengthy one. He cites the fact that there's no transparency, no one knows who the funders are. But
And he
surely you
didn't
knew
know
that.
that until yesterday?
Yeah, of course you knew that many, many years ago. I think, as you mentioned, 4 years ago, it was taken over by this by a group of by a group. So no one really knows what the funding source is.
And if I can just add, his former boss, Alan Rusbridger, wrote a lengthy piece, I believe in the Prospect, highlighting precisely this issue. But Friedland didn't discover it until this week.
Yeah, and to add to that, the point about the BBC trustee Bob Robbie Gibb, sorry, who's the director who stands on the board. That point is ignored by the mainstream media. The fact that this guy who sits on the BBC is pulling the BBC to align itself more closely with the hateful, anti-Palestinian, anti-Muslim rhetoric of the Jewish Chronicle. That part of the story is completely ignored. And that's, I think, for a lot of people, that's the most shocking thing. How this rag, you can call now, is has been allowed to continue to inflate and amplify anti-Muslim rhetoric, and for many, the whole Corbyn period is also fascinating because the Jewish Chronicle led the
Had a
crusade
starring role.
and played a starring role in expelling Corbyn from the party. And I think I'm wondering if the people who played a leading role will now question the motivations and the intentions. Isn't there a need to now ask who are the people funding the Jewish Chronicle that led this horrific campaign to undermine who was one of the more popular leaders here in the UK. So these are all unanswered questions. I'm not expecting an answer, but I think the British public need an answer given how prominent the Corbyn era was, how that's been so divisive, who was behind those divisions. If you're going to ask about Russian influence, why not ask about the influence pushing the Jewish Chronicle narrative? So these are all questions that need to be asked, and I thought it's worth us putting this out there. Let's go into a final two questions. First is we are 15th of September is the 4th anniversary of the so-called Abraham Accords. So Israel recently celebrated that and said that, the Abraham Accord has brought peace and stability in the region. So I didn't know whether to laugh or cry hearing. That's actually what the Israeli foreign minister said in his tweet, that the Abraham Accord has brought peace and stability in the Middle East. Just your response from that. The idea that you can leapfrog the Palestinian issue and have peace with the Arab countries would bring lasting peace to the region is, of course, pie in the sky, and it's been proven to be so. But yeah, 4 years on, what's your take on the so-called Abraham Accords?
Well, very briefly, the traditional approach has been that Arab-Israeli peace is the outcome of Israeli-Palestinian peace. In other words, Israel can enjoy normal relations with the surrounding Arab states once it ends its occupation and there is a Palestinian state. That's kind of the theory in it. You can also see it in the 2002 Arab Peace Initiative and so on. Of course, that equation began to be broken in the late 1970s, first with Egypt's separate peace with Israel, and so on. But I think the thing to understand about the excessively grandly entitled Abraham Accords is that they turned this equation on its head. In other words, Israel could achieve normal relations with Arab states, not only despite the absence of a Palestinian state, but could do so in order to further marginalize a Palestinian question. Essentially, what the Abraham Accords did is they provide a halal certificate to Greater Israel, and that's why Israel is celebrating them.
And this week we also saw the Houthis strike Israel directly, and that's quite for Israel anyway. That should be alarming because again it shows how war has become weapons have become commodified. A small army can inflict huge damage on a major regional power, if not a superpower. And the Houthis have been able to strike Israel directly. So, how significant is that?
Well, let's go back to the late 1960s and 1970s when the PLO was first, the guerrilla movements that constituted the PLO were deployed along the length of the Israeli-Jordanian Palestinian border, and then later in southern Lebanon. Their best weapons, supplied by, among others, the Soviet Union and Arab states, never got further than several dozen kilometers from that border. What happened yesterday is that, according to Ansar Allah, the Yemeni movement, also known as the Houthis, is that they fired a hypersonic missile from northern Yemen that traveled over 2,000 kilometers in the space of 11 and a half minutes and landed in central Israel, not far from Tel Aviv. And according to a number of reports, Israel's multi-layered air defense systems failed to detect this hypersonic missile on time and failed to engage with it. And this seems to be borne out by the reality that the Yemenis fired only a single missile. They didn't fire a swarm of missiles in the hope that one or more of them would penetrate Israel's air defenses. They fired only a single one in order, I think, to send a clear message that this is all we need. And you're going to have a lot more trouble if we start firing these either regularly or in larger numbers. Israel subsequently came out with the story that it detected this missile, that its air defenses engaged it, but that they only damaged rather than destroyed it. I think we can take Israel's statements with a grain of salt unless proven otherwise. And the other point, of course, is that the Yemenis have said that they fired this missile in as part of a new phase, responding to Israel's recent bombing of Hodeidah port in Yemen, but also as part of an escalation of their support front that started last year as a result of the situation in the Gaza Strip. And then the other element we need to bear in mind here, of course, is if this is what the Houthis can do from Yemen, located thousands of several thousand kilometers away, what's going to happen if Israel decides to initiate a full-scale conflict with Lebanon? And Hezbollah presumably has much more sophisticated missiles that can then reach anywhere in Israel, not in minutes, but in seconds. So I think these are all factors that we need to look at closely that get back once again to the fundamental unanswered question, which is the United States prepared to use its enormous leverage on Israel to end the genocide in the Gaza Strip in order to prevent the entire Middle East from going to hell in a handbasket? Or will it continue its unconditional, uncritical embrace of Israel at any cost, including basically forfeiting what it claims is its own primary objective, which is preventing further regional escalation? I think as long as Biden remains in the White House, it's unambiguously clear Israel can do as it pleases, and the only response from Washington will be sending it even more weapons. How this may change under either Harris or Trump, probably not much, but we'll have to wait and see.
That was my guest, Mouin Rabbani, joining me, Nasim Ahmed, for our weekly memo review show. Hope to see you again next week, Mouin, and also you guys listening, tune in for another conversation and review with me, Nasim, for our weekly review show. Bye-bye.